The Buzzbee Brute is one of those overlooked blasters, but really, it's almost like a little brother to the Rapidstrike. I got this blaster for $13 on clearance, and it just so happened that a electronics store by me was going out of business, so I was able to get a cool battery and charger for $10. Specs on the screen. First up, take apart the Buzzbee Brute by undoing the screws. Remove this front handle grip thing here, and take out all the screws as you go. Now this handle was a pain to get off. I abandoned this and come back to it later, but there's no good way to do this. You just have to pry it off. The stock, however, comes off much more easily. Just pry that off with a screwdriver. Take off the stock and gather up all your screws and put them away. I used an old spice container for this, and now my screws smell like nutmeg. Take out the battery tray, which is held in place by 2 or 3 screws, and we're going to need to modify this to have our battery pack fit in there. So you're going to need your saw and your scissors and a pair of pliers. Just snip off the scissors and that'll remove the 2 wires. We'll solder those together later. But for now, just take your pliers, pull out any remaining parts. I pulled out the injection molded fins that were in there just using pliers, and similarly, once you're done with that, you can take apart the tabs and the springs that were originally meant for those AA batteries that would have been powering them. Just take those out and they should come right out. Again, needle nose pliers are probably the best job for this. If you come across a soldered piece like this, you kind of have to squeeze the solder out and then use a screwdriver to peel those out and then get them out with the rest of the needle nose pliers. And then just use a knife to clean it up. And then of course, because we don't want sharp objects near a battery, we are going to clean that up with a piece of sandpaper. Now, we just need to cut off that back end. You can use a saw or you could just peel it off. I'm cutting a notch in the top of our battery pack here to allow the wires from the battery itself to feed into the top. Cut off this post so it doesn't poke into our battery, and then place it right in. That's the basis of our battery. I finally got this piece off. It just took a lot of prying. Now open up the whole blaster and you can see how it operates. When you pull back the trigger, there are 2 very simple metal tabs. The first one that it pushes back revs the motor, and the second one operates the pusher mechanism. So that's just how it works. It's a 2-stage trigger. Very, very simple. Now, the guy at the electronics store is going to sell you a $15 wire stripper, but don't buy into that. Just be very careful, use scissors, and make sure you don't get any of the strands when you do this. But if you do that, save yourself 15-20 bucks. Splice together the red wires from the Brute to your red extension wire, and splice together the black wires from your Brute to a black extension wire. And then just quickly solder those together. Put a piece of heat shrink tubing over those, we'll secure that later. And then, this is where Molex comes into play. The type of connector I had was incompatible with the one that came with the battery. I believe it is just a simple Molex, but I did not have the correct one. So, I just cut off the front of the Molex. This is not advised, but this is going on the dead part of the circuit, so I don't feel that bad. If you do it, just get the proper Molex connector. Now take the little Molex pins, and with a little bit of exposed wire there, just use your pliers and crimp the pieces of metal onto the wire. You want to leave some exposed wire sticking out on the solder pad of the Molex connector. This could also be done with a $35 device that the guy at the electronics store will try and sell you, but you just save $50 because you watched this video. Good job. Now take the exposed piece of wire and some solder on the solder pad and just lock those pieces of wire down into the Molex connections. And do not catch your table on fire with your soldering iron. Take the heat shrink tubing and just a lighter or some form of heat and shrink those. You could alternatively do this with butt connectors and electrical tape, but I think this method is more secure and has less of a chance of breaking on you. Now throw the Molex pins into the Molex connector itself, And now because I removed that front part, this is bidirectional, and because there are no diodes in the brute circuit, you can plug this in the wrong way and have the flywheel spinning backwards on you. Additionally, there's no really good way to lock this in now, so I just cover it in tape when I do it. But those exposed pieces are on the dead part of the circuit, so I don't really mind. Now, I lightened up the flywheels by just drilling out the holes from the injection molding areas on the flywheels. Put the stock back on and just get those wires to fit any old way. And if your main body isn't going back together, it is that gosh darn mag release right there. As you see, one piece was stuck in the other side and just refused to operate. Assemble your mag release and make sure that the angled part of the triangle is facing backwards like that, or it won't work. Now, just put the body back together, make sure everything is fitting just right, and put the stock on. We're going to modify that battery tray a little more than what I originally intended. We need to first screw that in, just give it a test fit, and see where everything's hitting. Now, there's a rib on that battery cover that needs to go out because we have a Molex connector in the way. So I'm going to just remove that with some pliers, very simply. Sand it down because we don't want sharp objects near a battery. And then give it a test fit. There's still some surfaces that are poking into it, so I need to remove this lip over here. I just scored it and then pulled it out with a pliers, and then for those other two parts I scored it again with my pocket knife and also removed it with pliers. And after that, the battery was fitting just fine with nothing rubbing against it. Now, that seems to do pretty well, but I needed some room for the wires, so I removed the top part and a little bit more from the front of that battery box there. And then after I did that, everything fit just fine and the battery was still perfectly secure, so it works pretty well for what it is. We put everything back together, and now, just to test fit, throw in 1 or 2 screws. The back of that stock extends just a little further past the battery, so we need to take up that space. I had a piece of high-density foam laying around, and that did the job just fine. Alternatively, you could just use some old darts and try that out. Now just screw everything back together, and let's give it a test fit with just some random darts. Insert magazine, and for single shots, there is just a touch of delay between when you pull the trigger and when the darts come out, but it's much better than stock. The motor really whines now, and you can get off some solid automatic bursts at a much higher rate of fire. This was an incredibly simple mod, and if you have the electrical know-how, give it a try.
Next objective, 1 star.